Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Woodburn's China webinar series on building your strategy in China. The pace of change in China is accelerating. Unprecedented geopolitics, exponential technologies, shifting demographics, and new social norms are reshaping the business environment. Organizations, whether B2B or B2C, need to be responsive and agile if they are to survive and thrive in this new normal. But in times of great change, it can be tempting to slip into a reactive frame of mind, fighting fires and rolling with what you know. Many businesses, large and small, fall into this pattern in China, overlooking vast societal, culture, technological, and political differences, but you don't have to. In this webinar series, we're going to take a step back from business as usual to develop a longer-term perspective which can survive shorter-term market changes. Woodburn Accountants and Advisors is offering this series on Build Your Strategy in China, free of charge, complimentary to everyone. And together with Qiva Global, we will provide you with information and tools to enrich your China business skills and enhance your market entry efforts to achieve success in the market. Today is part one of our webinar series on how to create a business strategy for the Chinese market. And I'm very pleased to have our guest speaker, Ellie Adams, who is the Managing Director of Qiva Global, to join us today. Now, just a couple of slides of intro for all of you. Who is this webinar really for? Well, at Woodburn, we've categorized three different types of individuals and companies that approach us. The first one is what I call the newbie to China. It's usually those individuals or companies that are looking for an opportunity or have already found an opportunity in China. And they're looking to gain a Chinese education now on how to protect their business and how to create a strategy for this new opportunity. The next category are the startups in China. So usually these are companies that have been established for a period of between 1 to 3 years in China. And they've been so focused on their core business that now, as mentioned in the intro, they're probably fighting fires and they want to get a hand onto the situation. They want to figure out how to get out of it and maybe focus a little bit more on strategy, on administration, on compliance. The next set is probably something you wouldn't imagine. It's the experienced China hands. So these are usually individuals or companies that have been around in China for 10, 15, 20 years. You know, you would think that they have all the experience at their fingertips, but I can tell you, nobody has the same experience in the Chinese market. Everyone has had different types of obstacles come their way. And especially for these individuals, it's all about learning what's fresh, what's new, getting new ideas on how to better grow their Chinese business and adapt as well. So I want to ask all attendees now, it would be great for Ellie and I if you could put into the chat section of the control panel, are you a newbie? Are you a startup? Are you an experienced China hand? This will give us great insight into who you actually are. And it will also guide us in terms of the presentation today in order, and the webinar series in order how to present our information. So how the webinar works, you are now in the GoToWebinar system. You have the option in the audio section to either use your computer audio or to switch to a telephone landline. If you are based in China, it is generally more secure if you use a telephone landline. That is just due to the Great Chinese Firewall and the system blockages over there. The same is also for people that are based in the Middle East, where there are also some firewalls that exist. We may run into some technical difficulties, although I doubt it. But if we do, it usually takes about 30 seconds for us to reboot and get back on. So don't exit from the webinar. We will be coming back on very shortly. The goal for Ellie and I in this webinar series is not to sell to you. We are here to educate you. So there might be times where we ask questions, where we want your input. Please be interactive with us, okay? We want this next 60 minutes, 70 minutes to be a valuable spend of your time. So use this opportunity to put questions, comments, etc. into the questions section or chat section of the control panel. Now, everyone has been muted, and obviously that is so that we can have a very smooth presentation with no interruptions. Otherwise, you might find that this then goes off to a 90-minute or 100-minute presentation. If you really want to focus, switch off your mobiles, grab yourselves a pen and paper, take some notes, and please, I can't emphasize more, interact with us so that we can also help you. So a little bit about myself. I'm the host of this webinar series. My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia, and I guess the big question for you all is, why am I able to help you? Well, I have been for 16 years in the corporate services sector in China, and I've helped and worked with over 500 international companies on their market strategy, market entry, implementation, and growth in the Chinese market. I'm also the creator of the China Roadmap program, which will be part 3 of this webinar series. So if you're interested on knowing what is the normal roadmap of any company that's going into China, join me for day 3, and we'll be going into depth about that. A lot of the case studies that I use within my presentations are usually personal stories regarding my own companies or regarding my clients' companies. So they're all factual information about what is actually going on in the Chinese market. Now, if you enjoy this webinar series or you would like to learn more about the Chinese market, you can subscribe free to our newsletter, which goes out about 3 times a week, all with very different information. It is free of charge, and you can subscribe easily on our homepage by just simply inserting your email address. Or you can follow me or the company on LinkedIn, and all of our previous webinars have been recorded and are uploaded on our YouTube channel as well. So the next is Ellie, who's going to be talking. I'm just going to unmute her now. A little bit about how Ellie and I met. Ellie has been on some previous webinars of mine, and we also reached out to each other and met in London. Qiva Global is a management consulting firm that focuses on developing strategies for companies that are going into the Chinese market. And it's such a nice added value to the services that Woodburn provides, because nobody should be going into China without a strategy. Strategy, education, research, strategy, this is really the first steps you need to take to even consider about transacting in the Chinese market. It does not mean necessarily implementing something, but even just transacting with partners in China, you need to have a proper strategy in place in terms of how to do that. So this is how Ellie and I collaborate with each other. We work on clients together, where Ellie does work on the strategy side of things, and then Woodburn helps on the side of, or I help clients on the side of the actual implementation and corporate services side. So I'm going to stop talking now. I've talked enough. Ellie, I'm going to leave it to you to, add whatever you'd like to add, and just let me know when you want to switch slides.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, and just to follow up, my partner and I have listened to your webinars a few times and always been very impressed by this depth of information and the honesty of it. So it's a real pleasure to be presenting with you. If you don't mind scrolling to the next slide, I'll just do a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview in a moment about who I am and what my business does. We're going to look at what we hope you're going to get out of this webinar today, so the things you're going to take away, and look at some of the strategy frameworks that I use both in previous careers and currently that I hope are going to be quite helpful to you. We're going to look at some case studies. These are examples of clients I've worked with where I think we can pull out some of the learnings that they have made through using strategy frameworks, so you can see how they can be applied. And then we're going to end with a Q&A where I'll gladly sort of answer any questions that you have thought of as I've been presenting. So if you don't mind scrolling to the next slide, thank you. This is me. A bit about me. I did a sciences degree, and having done my sciences degree, I decided that I really wasn't actually going to be a scientist, and I ended up in China, as so many of us do. And I thought I'd go and study a bit of Mandarin, and I became utterly addicted to learning the language. I lived with families whilst in China, first in Beijing, and I moved to Kunming because I wanted to study some dialect. I was there for a few years, and ever since I have been always very fascinated by China, hooked, as it were. I joined Thomson Reuters following my time in China and got sent straight back out there, to be honest. And so my career has really been so focused on China since that early initial sort of introduction to Thomson Reuters. I was on their graduate scheme, and then latterly at Monitor Deloitte, which is a management consultancy, where I've worked with big international firms, government, etc. Now, Qiva is a bit of an amalgamation of these two sort of interests, management consultancy and my sort of geographical focus on China. And if we move to the next slide, what we do is we work with companies at different stages of their development. So we work with clients who are fresh to market. They don't know what to do. They don't know which way they want to go in terms of launching. There are lots of options. We work with companies who are already quite tested in the market, but actually want to work out what's going on specific to their industry and competitors and work out how they grow best. And then we work with those firms who need a strategy to scale. And by that, I mean companies where they want to go all in. They want to compete on a local basis as a local operator in the domestic market in China. So our services are geared to whatever stage of development you're at. Now, if we move to the next slide, what I want to talk about today is we use this word strategy a lot, and I find it quite a difficult term sometimes because it's almost lost its currency. People use it so freely now, but that's a shame because it is so fundamental to making decisions. And that's what I would like people to get out of this webinar today. Not so much strategy, but actually seeing strategy as a means of taking effective decisions, because that is what your strategy should be. It should be able to weather storms in that it gives you an ability to say, okay, I've hit this roadblock, this is my decision. The other thing I want this to do is help you apply a methodology, because there is a lot of ambiguity and hype where it comes to China. And it can be really bamboozling, particularly if you don't speak the language or you're unfamiliar with the terminology or sometimes the concepts. So sometimes by rooting these hyped up sort of phenomenon in methodology, you're much better able to make a sensible decision that works for your business. And then finally, I hope what we're going to have by the end of this presentation is for you a sort of a guideline in terms of how you start going about making your strategy, regardless of whether you are fresh to market, quite mature in the market, or even regardless of your industry focus. So next slide, please. Thank you very much. So when it comes to strategy frameworks, there are so many. You'll find lots of management consultancies will have a particular preference. To be quite honest, I don't think it really matters, so long as you have a framework that is what we call in management consulting MECE, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. And what this means is that you can capture everything discreetly within this framework. And it means that you don't miss off questions, because essentially a strategy framework is about making sure you're asking yourself the right questions and you're challenging yourself so that you don't just fabricate that this is a great idea, I'm going to go and do it. You've got a question there that says, wait, but what implications does that hold for X, Y, or Z? So that really is the purpose of a strategy framework. And you've got so many. I'm sure you yourselves will have come across them, maybe used some. So on this slide, what I've got here are two sort of options for you. And if you look at the top, so I need a strategy for on the far left-hand corner, and you can go up to a proposition. So for a proposition, if you've got sort of a product, you might want something quite straightforward. So something I call W5H. I find is very useful if you just need a very clear-cut way of making sure you've covered all your bases in terms of what you're describing as your product or your proposition. This is a really straightforward one that journalists will often use when they're interviewing. It just makes sure they're asking all the right questions. I'm going to show you how this can be used quite effectively in a more complex business scenario shortly. And it's often sniffed at because it is so simple, but it's effective. So I include it here. Something that's not actually on this page, but that I would really recommend that you look up, and it also fits within these more simplistic strategy frameworks, is something called the Lean Canvas. Lean as in L-E-A-N, canvas. And again, that's a really simple framework that just makes sure you're asking the right questions of yourself before you pursue your operations. Now, the bottom half of this slide is the slightly more, we're getting to the more complex frameworks. And for these, they're much more suited to where you've got a really complex business situation. Maybe you're managing multiple stakeholders, you've got multiple products and propositions, you've got lots of operational things to consider, and there are certain conflicts that you need to work through. It also gives you the ability to add a sort of chronology and timing to your decisions in a way that W5H, for instance, is very static. It's now. So what we're going to do is have a look at how these different strategy frameworks work. And I'm going to focus for the time being on cascade of choices and target operating model. And then we're going to go into looking how I've applied those in my own work. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, which is, we call it cascade of choices. Now, I have not created this. I'm sure you know that, but this is actually quite a well-known framework. And it was developed by, I want to say, someone who worked at Procter & Gamble, and I'm shocked that I can't remember his name, but there's a book, and if you want the book or want to know the name of the book, please get in touch with me and I can send you the author's name. It's called, I think it's called Playing to Win, okay? And this is a really, really popular framework in certain management consultancies, and I'm going to show you why. So in every business decision, in any business, you know, people always say this, and again, it's sort of lost its currency, but it's very worthwhile to say it, that you do need to know what you're going to do. What is your objective? What is your vision? So on the far left box where we say, what are your goals and aspirations? It sounds very management speak, but it's very fundamental that we know that before we start. The next box goes to where to play. Now, where to play talks about where exactly in your market are you going to compete? What part of the value chain are you going to compete in? And some of these questions I think we often take for granted in our own markets, markets familiar to us, but it's very interesting when you look at China, because often your understanding or the way your market operates in your home markets can be very, very different in China in terms of how that industry is structured. So asking these questions of yourself before going in heavy and investing a lot of money is very, very sensible. Where to play also covers things in terms of, you know, geographically, where is your audience going to be most concentrated, for instance? Which customer segments are you going to prioritize? By segments here, you might think about category. And category is a really interesting one because a category is not just sort of the phenotypes of your product in terms of maybe it's a phone, it's the benefits it provides. And the benefits that you think your product provides, let's say in the UK market or the German market, are, I would hasten to bet, very different to the benefits your product is going to provide in China. So these are very important questions that we ask. Now, the next stage is how to win. So once you know where exactly you stand a competitive advantage, you need to work out how you're going to compete for that. So what activities do you need to do in order to target those clients? How do you position yourselves differently to the competitors? And indeed, who are your competitors? What are the sources of differentiation that you are going to have to work with in order to target your strategic area of focus? The next two sections, the capabilities and the configuration. Now, these are really interesting because I find a lot of the time companies will go straight to these. They'll say, okay, I need a woofie, or I need talent on the ground. I need a sales director. Now, there's no point going to that process until you know what they're going to do and where they're going to do it and how they're going to do it. So the whole point of this cascade of choices is that it is iterative. So it means you can use this. So if you're, for instance, your colleague is absolutely adamant that you need to do X now, let's say set up a business in Hong Kong, you can look at this cascade of choices and you can say, okay, well, you're in stage 5 now. Let's go back to stage 1 and 2 and 3 and work out what that is actually going to provide in terms of value and function. So the cascade of choices is wonderful in that it gives you an ability to pull apart what you're doing and why you're doing it, so that every operational decision that you might make in, let's say, box 4, required capabilities, or box 5, processes and systems, every operational decision gets rooted back to where you are actually going, so that you can kind of sense check yourself, because it's always very tempting to say, I need this, I definitely need this. And sometimes you might do. Other times you might need something else that delivers that value better. The next slide is the target operating model. Now, I'm also going to show you how you can use this. And again, remember, any strategy framework, it doesn't actually matter what you use so long as it is mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. It gives you all of the buckets of areas that you need to be thinking about. So for a target operating model, I would use this more in an operational design process. And this shows you the different layers of an organization. So we're going to have a look at this later in terms of how you can apply this, but you can perhaps already start taking this away and thinking about how you would separate your own business into these different strands. Perhaps do it for the market you know best to start with, then do it for China. And it will create lots of questions, I suspect, you know, and potentially gaps, which is brilliant. It doesn't matter if you've got a gap. It doesn't matter if you've got a question. In a way, the whole purpose of having a strategy framework is to show you where you don't know stuff and to make you challenge your assumptions, because it's so much better to challenge these assumptions upfront rather than pursuing something that is, you know, going to have a gap in it in terms of your thinking and planning. Thanks, Christina. If you could go to the next slide. What I want to do now is have a look at a case study of a client that I worked with. And this was a large consumer brands business, very, very successful internationally. And they did sports nutrition products. They had already entered the Chinese market via a cross-border e-commerce platform. And they were very ambitious and they wanted to grow. So when we started working together, this particular client was very, very clear that they wanted to focus on how to win. From their perspective, they had their objective, they knew where they wanted to go, they thought they knew where their customers were and where their strategic opportunity was. And now they wanted to know how to go and get it and expand it. So it was an exciting brief. Now, if we look at the next slide, this shows where the blue box shows exactly where they thought they were. The how to win block, which is blue. This is where they thought they wanted to sort of really focus their work on. And then that was my brief in terms of preparing a process of strategy for them. What I found as I did my analysis was actually quite common in terms of what I often find when I work with clients, is that they are focusing on the how to win without necessarily understanding where they are going to have a strategic advantage. So I certainly, from looking at their data, their sales data, their customer analysis, I felt that actually they were not in the market that they thought they were in. They were not competing in a category that they realized they were competing in. And so whilst they thought they were doing reasonably well, it became abundantly clear that they could do a lot better if they were orientating themselves in the right direction. So one of the exercises that I did with this client, which we're going to look at on this next slide, is a simple use of who, why, what, where, when, and how. So W5H. Like I said, this is a really simple framework. You wouldn't use this for a full business strategy, but you can apply this to discrete things, propositions, products, to really highlight what you don't know. So for this particular client, we worked through this, and actually I got them to do all of this. So this is what they wrote. Who is their customer in China? Well, they thought their customer was pretty much 70% male. Urban, middle class, white collar, educated. This is sports nutrition. They thought these guys were working hard, playing hard, wanting to keep healthy. And certainly, I'm based in the UK and in London, and it's very easy for me, based on my London experience, to assume that is who my customer would be, because that is the majority customer for them globally. So why were their customers drawn to their products? They felt very drawn by performance, health, balanced nutrition, maintaining that healthy balance of work and life. They felt the benefits they looked for were around performance and endurance, because that is their international branding. It's a performance endurance product. Why not? It makes total sense that your customers would buy into that. Where were the products used? Well, they thought probably similarly to how their products are used everywhere in the world, on a cycle ride, outdoors, gyms, probably tier 1, tier 2 cities where there is a bit more affluence, and a bit more of an abundance of gyms. When? Well, they thought maybe mid, post exercise, tired. How? Maybe tucked in a jersey, added to water to drink. This is a really excellent exercise, because you are in effect pulling apart who your customer is and checking your understanding, because even for some of these, for their domestic customers, that they were really scratching their heads to think. So I think you can use this irrespective of your market. It's just a very helpful exercise. Now, if we move to the next slide, this is where it got rather interesting, because I'd obviously been away and done my homework and research. And what we found was actually their understanding of their customer in China was very, very, their customer globally looked very, very different to their customer in China. So in China, the majority of their customers were not male, they were female. That's a huge difference when you think about how you go to market and how you win in your market. They were urban, yep, middle class, yep, white collar, yeah, majority, educated. Now that's an interesting one, because we're all educated differently. And I think we often hold a lot of assumptions around how people therefore view certain things. And in the health space, this is interesting, because we are all educated to have different beliefs about different types of components. So for instance, in China, you might look at vitamin C as a sort of having a whitening effect on your skin. Whereas for me, I make my kids have it for, just general nutrition and health. We have different associations. So that was an interesting one there. Why? Now, despite our clients' belief that, people were going to their products for performance, balanced life, what we found actually was, with a 70% consumer, sort of 70% of consumers being female, actually one of the biggest draws towards their products was around dieting and losing weight. It wasn't really about performance. So that's a massive change. And the benefits, well, performance and endurance, yeah, absolutely. I think there were customers who for that resonated with. But the main benefit was losing weight. It was protein. And again, you have to think about how people are educated, but also in terms of the differences culturally and practically. China, the protein structure of their diet was very different. They will traditionally have small pieces of meat scattered in, a big collective meal, rather than a big, lots of sausages on a plate as we might do in the West. Their protein structure is different. They get protein supplements in order to, they might make association around strength and height with protein, and therefore they might look to protein for to supplement that. So again, the benefits that they felt they were delivering their customers were completely off. Where? This one fascinated me, because whilst this was generally within a sort of exercising, they felt they were in an exercising category, what I found from looking at their customer data were that given people were using this product to lose weight, to diet, to stay healthy and thin, they weren't necessarily using it for exercise. They were using it whilst on the bus, quick breakfast. At university, where you don't have the time to make a meal, but you want to stay healthy and thin, perhaps. So again, a very different interpretation of what actually happens. And again, when People were using these products breakfast, lunch, and overtime. In China, where there's a culture of very long hours of work, they call it 996, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. People were using these products as a supplement so as not to have takeaway whilst doing overtime. And finally, where it came to how, these people were using products in a very different way to the way they were used to. So for instance, they were looking at this product as a supplement. They wanted to add milk to it to, again, enhance the protein content of the product. They were eating it as fruit, wanted a healthy breakfast, baking. So for me, this exercise was absolutely fascinating, and is a great demonstration of how you can use a really simple framework to just pull apart your assumptions. And it's fine to have assumptions, they're very useful. But I'm often really astounded by the assumptions that we all have that get untested. And I myself am completely guilty of this, which is why I like to use things like this to try and tease out where I have overlooked things. If we move to the next slide, I'm now going to look at another case study. So this is from a very different sector. Here I was working with a company, a science company, that worked in the area of microscopy. And they wanted to benchmark themselves against their industry competitors. They wanted to know where they could play a role and shape conversation. In a market that is so noisy, why say the same things when you can say something unique and different? And they wanted to work out how their industry worked, so they would know how to increase their sales, how they would, scale their business. So what we did here, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, thank you. So I talked about target operating model briefly. Now, remember, you can use these models in any way you like. They are just a means of asking questions or putting some structure and methodology around your research. So for this instance, what I did was we used the target operating model to do a competitor comparison. And we wanted to make sure that our competitor comparison didn't miss things, because it's so easy to miss things. It's so easy not to ask the right questions. So we applied this target operating model to their competitors in China. Now, when you're going to do this, and I would really recommend that you do things like this, but obviously with the caveat that you know who your competitors are, because to be honest, they are often very different to the ones you might assume where it comes to the Chinese market. But if you go to the next slide, you can see how I have then developed this target operating model to help them benchmark. Now, I'm sure many of you have used maturity scales in the past. Now, these are really, really popular with management consultants because they remove some of the subjectivity that you often come across by giving sort of a standard and a rule that says, okay, you might say this person's brilliant, but tell me why. What are the reasons? What are the objective reasons? So down the left-hand side, the first column, we've got all of the target operating model categories: customer segments, channels, products, processes, information, technology, organization, people, physical location. At the top, you've then got a scale of sort of low scoring to high scoring, and you can call that whatever you like. In this instance, we have used the names that you can see here, but the far right is going to be the ideal state. But remember, you don't always have to be in the ideal state. I'm not saying with these benchmarking exercises you have to hit dark green for all of them. It depends on your objectives. Sometimes you don't need to. But back to benchmarking, why this is so useful is you can start to create rules for what good looks like in these categories. So for instance, for your industry, what is the best in terms of customer segments? What customer segments do you need to be targeting? Where are they? What do they do? Channels. Which channels are the main channels used in your industry that you have to hit in order to meet your growth targets? You can start creating basically a rule book. And with this rule book, these are, they're meant to be objective. So the characteristics that apply for a company to be either great or doing mediocre or doing badly. So it means that when you do convey, your benchmark assessment to your colleagues, when they question you in terms of, well, why have you made that assertion that, X, Y, and Z is not doing very well, you're grounding it in something that is factual and objective. So I really recommend using the target operating model in your benchmarking exercises to do some sort of maturity assessment. And this is what we did for our client here. And it meant that we were able to look across all of their competitors. We made sure we checked all of the levels of a target operating model, all of the associated questions within those categories, so that we didn't miss things. And it also meant that we could objectively, well, as objectively as you can do in these situations, but add some objectivity to measuring how well they were performing against them. And also it created a great visualization in terms of where they sat across all of these different levels of a target operating model. For instance, they might have been doing customer targeting a lot better, but their channels, they were not exploiting all of the channels that their competitors were using. So it's a great exercise in terms of pulling out how you could potentially look at a particular area of your business model in China to improve it. The next thing our client wanted to do, if you move to the next slide, was around finding their marketing niche. Sorry, Christine, would you mind moving to the next slide for me? Thanks. So this is part of the same project. And what our client wanted to do here was they recognized that when it comes to marketing in China, you can just add your noise. But does that work? I don't know. I'm sure a marketing agency will tell you it will, and they'll add a bit more nuance to it. But I think there's a really valuable exercise in working out exactly where you, as an international brand who comes at things slightly differently to your Chinese competitors, but has value, where your voice is going to actually create something meaningful to your Chinese customers. So what we did here, and again, I really recommend this whenever you have a question like this in terms of where am I going to stand out, you set your criteria. So how can you stand out? So we had some China-specific criteria, and we had some client-specific criteria that we wanted to make sure any area that we found in terms of marketing, hit these sort of tick boxes. So, for instance, we didn't want to find an area for them to focus on in their marketing that was not really thought about or demanded. We wanted to find something that was not overcrowded. There weren't too many people talking about it. We wanted to identify an area of discussion where international organizations actually do have an advantage. I mean, why? It's not a level playing field. So don't set yourself up to lose before you start. Find something where an international company is going to have that advantage. Our client-specific criteria, our client was very focused on sort of innovation, scientific discovery, and we felt they had a very strong USP in this area. So we wanted to make sure the area of marketing focus would allow them to show that. They're very passionate about sustainability. They wanted to demonstrate their performance advantages without being too overt and just telling people why they were brilliant. They wanted to have sort of substantive content to talk about in order to show it. And they wanted an ability to talk about their technological expertise. So our process, which is illustrated on the right-hand side of this slide, was to look across all of the discussions around LED fluorescence microscopy, because it's a sea of discussion and information always on any topic. And we measured all of those discussions against those criteria. And this provided us with quite a clean way of just knocking things out. And part of the process of strategy is about getting rid of the stuff that does not matter. There is so much noise. Focus on the stuff that matters. So what we found through this process, if you move to the next slide, is, like I said, there's lots of discussion about LED microscopy, and we bucketed that into, you can see, 6 boxes in this sort of second layer of this, what looks like an org chart, but isn't. This chart actually shows the discussion sort of boxes where it relates to LED microscopy. And we were able to bucket all of those discussions into these groupings of maybe it was academic, maybe it was focused on advantages between LED and alternatives, basic sort of discussion about LED microscopy, medical research, that was the one that was actually the loudest in China for our client, medical research and how LED microscopy applies to it. There was some discussion around optimizing performance, and then there was some around life sciences. So by looking across all of the key conversational channels and online media channels, we were able to identify 3 buckets of conversation that, satisfied our clients' criteria. And within that, interestingly, TB, tuberculosis, was actually one of the most prevalent areas of discussion. And the reason this is so interesting is because tuberculosis is something that we do not really struggle with our client didn't in their home market. It's not a massive problem. Now, when you take it to China, tuberculosis continues to be a very large problem, particularly in less urban centers. And therefore, our client hadn't realized that their customers in China were using their products and using them to talk about tuberculosis. But also, it was going to be a really interesting area for them to add value to, because what we found was that one of their products, which in fact wasn't really marketed into the Chinese market, they'd completely discounted it because it was a lower price product and it was actually quite simple. But what we found was that this lower price product that was actually very simple was absolutely perfect for screening for tuberculosis. So through looking at their marketing, doing a marketing analysis like this, identifying which topics they could actually differentiate on, they not only found a voice in terms of where they were going to do their marketing, but they also were able to link that back into their sales system so that they could actually bring a product to the market that was going to tackle this area of unforeseen need. So I find this a very interesting example of how strategy links into your marketing and it links into your sales. It ties it all together and it gives your operational decisions, a meaning and a purpose. So to summarize, I think some of the key things I'd like you to take away from this is that strategy should not be static. You don't just develop a strategy and go. And it's very much something that you can control. It varies depending on what's going on, short-term blips, etc. It's something that I would really recommend you have as a sort of roadmap that you go back to all the time. It's an iterative process, much like the cascade of choices. You will learn things. You're working in a dynamic, changing environment that's going to effect changes across all of your different areas of operations and how you think and how you go about them, and that's totally fine. Strategy is not static. You do not need to put a halo around it and think it's put on a mantelpiece. It's there for you to play with. The second thing I would say is that strategy is all about the process rather than the outcome. There is no singular outcome, in my opinion. It is a means of decision making, and that is an ongoing process for you. So where you go to people who say, oh, you should just do X, that's an outcome, and it's not your outcome. Strategy gives you an ability to say, okay, I hear what you're recommending. I'm going to put this into my decision making and go through a process to come out with how I'm going to play this. So I really do emphasize that strategy is it's an enabling decision-making process. It's not itself an outcome. And the last thing I'd like to say is that where it comes to China, there is so much noise. I'm always very aware of this. New products, new concepts, new phenomena, new super apps, literally every day. But actually, if you approach your China business with a methodology and a sort of, a focus on the business side of it, with a strategy, you can kind of sweep aside some of the hype, because it means when you do hear about certain new phenomena or new things, you can actually put them into a meaningful framework and say, okay, well, this is delivering X. Actually, I don't need this for my business. I am focused on A, and therefore I need B. Strategy just gives you a framework, I would say, in this instance, to just get rid of some of that noise and allow yourself to focus on your concerns. if you want to talk about this anymore, or, you know, Christina, I know is organising an event for us to do in London where we're going to be helping people with their strategy development. Please let us know if you have an interest in participating in that. If you have any questions regarding building your own strategy, it's easy for me to say, you know, here are the frameworks, go do it. I'm aware it's often not that simple, and often you need some objective outsiders to provide some support. So if you do want to get in touch to ask any questions, I'd be delighted to hear from you. I'm going to be doing another webinar tomorrow on building your sales strategy. So that kind of takes these concepts to the next level. And so if you have an interest in thinking about how you now sort of proceed into whether it's cross-border e-commerce, distributors, I welcome you to listen to that. Thanks, Christina.
Ellie, thanks a lot. I just want to reemphasize, if you want to get in touch with Ellie, you can connect with her on LinkedIn, look at the website, email. There will be copies of the presentation provided to all registrants and attendees. So don't worry, you'll be getting a copy of this as well. You don't have to rush to copy Ellie's email address or anything like that down. You will be getting an email. So a copy of this. So I want to move on to the Q&A, and I think one of the things that I just want to touch on from my perspective, because this was, you know, part of Ellie's conclusion, is strategy is continuous. I highlight this a lot in terms of business planning and budgeting. It's not something that should happen just once. It is something that should be continuous, because like we are right now in the situation, there is a crisis in China, there's the coronavirus, and you do have to adapt your strategy. You do have to adapt your budget. You do have to adapt your business planning based on different circumstances that may arise in the market. So it's not something that you do once, you put it in the drawer and you forget about it. And Ellie emphasized it, but I want to re-emphasize it again. It's something that really should be continuous. So I think one of the first questions I personally have, because I see this a lot in my business, is Ellie, you were mentioning a lot about creating a strategy to make effective decisions. But I have seen that in a lot of companies, it is very difficult for the person who is developing the strategy to get the board to actually come down to make the decisions. Yeah. In your experience, what helps a board make these types of decisions to move forward with a China strategy? I assume that one of them would be actually using a third party to create the strategy and kind of place more emphasis on it than someone who's working internally within the organization. But when you're working, for example, in these two case studies, how were, you know, the strategy was then done, it was shown very clearly what should be the next steps. Were these companies flexible enough to make decisions right there and then?
That's such a good question. That is such a good question, because it is such a challenge for so many people. And like you say, that's often where I become involved, because it's very difficult, whether you're talking on a personal level, looking at yourself to come up with a strategy, or in terms of an organization, helping your stakeholders come up with a strategy. It's very difficult to get that sort of buy-in. So with these two cases, there had been that buy-in up front, which made it a lot easier. However, so when you make a good point, strategy is about decision making. It's a decision making framework, and organizations are complex and they've got lots of stakeholders. So if you have the ability to help use these frameworks to help other people make those decisions, I find this is a very effective way of doing things. And that's really kind of why my services are used, because you create that impartial observer who's able to actually go in and ask the dumb questions. That's actually a lot of the time that's what a management consultant is. They apply a methodology and they ask dumb questions that help people feel they are empowered to make these decisions, because strategy is dependent on people buying into where you're going. So you're right, if you don't have that buy-in, it's extremely difficult. I would say that strategy developed in isolation is probably not going to be affected. You do need to get that up front, or you have to go through this process, process over outcome of getting people's buy-in, getting people to feel they have ownership, getting people to understand the challenges, and therefore, for instance, the cascade of choices. Your boss might say you need something, and actually if you're helping him to work through, or her work through, those cascade of choices, it gives you something a bit more concrete to say, I absolutely hear you, what a fantastic idea. You do know that if you look back against your initial objective here, though, you could do that in X, Y, or Z other ways. So I would really advocate using this as you could use it in so many ways, but you're completely spot on. Stakeholders are key.
So one of the questions that came up was, I think everyone is sort of convinced that strategy needs to be developed in order to go into the Chinese market, because there's so many aspects that you have to look at. But in case study one, I was fascinated actually by, what became the reality of their strategy, and who was their target market, and who were they segmenting to, and how, and whatnot. How did they come to those conclusions? I mean, they initially, I assume, had their first draft. How did they realize that their target was not male, but it was female? Did they do focus groups? What was the methodology behind there to figure all that out, that it was so different from what they originally thought?
Well, actually, that was our work. So what we did was look at their sales data, and we looked at their customer data. So we did desk analysis and focus groups to actually work that out. So for them themselves, they and I find this quite a lot. People will treat their China business a little bit more in a hands-off way. So they'll say, okay, my distributor's got that, I'm not going to touch it. Whereas if it was any other market, you would get dirty with your data and understand who your customer was. So they could have done this. I get that sort of language, not being able to read it is an issue, but this was all their owned data. So we essentially plowed through it and analysed it for them. Otherwise, their, as you saw, their assessment had been quite off the money.
Yeah, very, very off the money.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
they wouldn't have been able, their whole marketing strategy would probably have had to be completely upended based on the new data, right?
Yeah. I mean, they were performing fine. This is the thing. But do you want to perform fine or kind of outperform? If you know who you're targeting, your options for how you grow and scale your business are so much more attractive and optimized. The funny thing is, you find this so much where it comes. I find this so much in China. Our assumptions are killer. And that's okay to admit that. We all have them. It's just having the I guess, the humility and the confidence to say, okay, I'm happy for you to like look at my data and tell me what's off.
Right.
As far as anyone can, use data.
So what, so if you are brand new to the market and you don't have the data, what do you do to answer these cascading questions? I mean, what work is then done to find that out?
So the big caveat here is, can you read Mandarin? Because in order to do this sort of research, you do need to be able to read Mandarin. But you can do a lot of this work, provided you do speak and read Mandarin, by actually looking at what your competitors do. So China as a market is very closed down in terms of data. So a lot of the reason I was able to do this for this client is because I had access to their data. Now, you can't get that quite so easily if you're not, for instance, this one, we had a lot of data from their Tmall platform. Now, if you're not on a Tmall platform, you don't have that, but you can do open source research. If you go into, for instance, an e-commerce platform and you find your competitors, or who you think your competitors are, have a look at what they're doing. Read their customer comments. Or I find social media is actually very fascinating in China because it's used so differently. People will use it for search, etc. So again, if you go and do some due diligence within a social media app, you'll quickly find out what customers are concerned by. Particular influencer communities, Little Red Book, or WeChat groups. Go and read what they're talking about. And often it's really interesting, and it raises new questions for you, so that you can then go back to your e-commerce platform and think, are these actually my competitors? I'm not sure.
I think it's fascinating that you say you need to read Chinese to do all of that, because it's very true. I think the issue that a lot of companies do is that they hire interns to do that who can't analyze it properly because they're not experienced enough to do it. Right.
That's again a very interesting thing I come across a lot, because I obviously have Chinese colleagues who work with me, and they are absolutely brilliant. But I think we approach problems in a very different way. And I've certainly found with my Chinese colleagues, they really like to tell me the answer, and I often don't like the answer. I want to understand the process, because there isn't a correct answer, right? It's so subjective. It's dependent on your business. So I think in my education, I've been taught to be very critical. You question everything. And I think sometimes if you ask a little bit, and I'm not saying Chinese people cannot do that. I've got brilliant colleagues who do that. But it's I wouldn't say if you get an intern, they will necessarily go through that same rigorous questioning. They might feel the pressure to say, okay, the answer is X, when actually what you're looking for is someone who's going to apply some sort of methodology. They're not going to be fearful to tell you, actually, no, that's completely wrong. And so that's where a lot of companies do go wrong, because like you say, they say, okay, I'm going to employ this cheap person over here who speaks Mandarin. Go. That's not the way to do it.
Right. Well, I think also the biggest, and I thought this was quite interesting, is they don't give direction to the intern or to the person they've just employed. So, you know, your cascading questions was fascinating to me, because they hire the person, and the question they will ask them is, figure out how to win.
Yeah.
Figure that out before saying, okay, what is our vision? How are we going to segment it, etc.
Yeah.
They don't give any of that direction to them. So, they're already coming on board a bit lost.
And it's a really difficult position to put your Chinese colleague in when they don't know your business. And I wonder sometimes whether this comes from a lack of confidence, which I really think, even if you don't speak Mandarin, it doesn't matter. You know your business better than anyone. You can ask these hard questions, but I guess it has to be you asking those hard questions. You cannot give that responsibility to someone else who probably doesn't have your confidence or knowledge of the business to come up with those answers for you.
Right. I'm going to put you on the spot now, because I'm going to give you what my belief is, because I'm guessing that you produce reports for clients once you've done your desk work or field study, right? You produce a report that you spend. Okay, so I'm not a report reader. I've always hated it. Never want to look through it. And my biggest belief has always been, you need someone on the ground to do a lot of this work, where you can get daily updates, and they're working on your behalf, and they're going to get on. What is the difference between that, between having someone that you've hired on the ground who does all of this field work versus using a management consultancy firm to do it on your behalf, and then you get a report that you've got to look through, read through?
So I'm going to be really management consultancy with you, I guess. And I would say, so a real phrase we use in management consulting is that, and I hate using it, but it's got validity, so I do. Form should follow function. So your response to what you need, person on the ground, fine. There are loads of things where you need someone on the ground in China, but what are they doing? So it depends, doesn't it? If you need someone to analyze all of your data, well, you don't need someone on the ground in China. If you want someone to be an intermediary between all of your sales parties, yeah, you totally need someone on the ground in China. So I think it depends on what benefit and value and function you need for your business. And then, it comes from that. But I agree with you.
That's actually going through the cascading questions, actually.
Yeah,
to determine
exactly.
whether you need someone on the ground or not.
Exactly. And I would say that, I share your feeling about reports. Reports really are what you should hope, in a way, is that a report, when it comes out, it just gets filed. Because actually, when I say process over outcome, for management consultants, it's the process that matters. By the time you come to the end deliverable, everyone should know what that end deliverable is. They don't need to read the report, because they will have decided what goes into that report. The report is the final sort of ticked off version of what you've all agreed on,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Right. Okay. That does make sense. I mean, for me, the 3 slides you had for each case study, that's a clear overview of what should be the next steps. That's me. That's me. I mean, I'm a visual person. I completely understood those 3 sides. I would have been able to make a decision just with those 3 sides on what should be the next steps. But I guess, you know, everyone is always a little bit different on that. How long does it normally take to do your work? I mean, once you have a brief from the client, you know, let's say for case study 1, from start to finish, what would have been the length of time to do all of that desk research?
Well, for that one, I probably spent my colleagues about 3 weeks building up our knowledge of their sales and customer data prior to doing a workshop. So the workshop itself was 1 day, because to your point earlier, this is about sort of getting stakeholders on board, and workshop is always a really good way of doing that, because you get everyone who has to make a decision in a room, you present the data, and you get everyone on the same page. So in terms of the actual doing for the client, 1 day for that project. That was a workshop project. But in terms of the analysis, throughout 3 weeks. Yeah.
3 weeks. So that's
I mean, it always depends.
That's not
on
slow. That's actually quite quick work,
well,
from my
I mean,
perspective.
yeah, you don't want it to take ages, and really a strategy shouldn't get in the way of you making operational decisions. It doesn't need to be 3 months of hard graft. It just needs to give you what you need to make decisions. So it will always vary depending on the complexity of those decisions. But in an ideal world, strategy is quick. It's enabling.
Right. So I guess now comes the tricky question about what's happening right now in China. You know, with the coronavirus, I'm guessing and I'm hoping that everyone is updating their strategy for 2020. What, you know, on the other side, I personally have a lot of companies approaching me saying, we're going to halt our investment, we're going to halt our strategy for China. What's your take on that, Ellie?
Well, I have clients in 2 camps. I've got some pretty pragmatic. Well, first of all, I think, you know, you've touched on this before. There's a really human response to this, and I think that needs to be met head on by anyone who's dealing in China, in terms of, you know, acknowledging and sympathizing with those suffering from this. Now that's a quick response, that's not a strategy. But in terms of your question, there are 2 camps. There are people who are seeing the pragmatic opportunity here, and those that are delaying decision making. For me personally, I think this is it's difficult. I don't want this to sound callous. You know, I have great sympathy for those who are affected by this, but this is another bump in a road where you're going to have loads of bumps. And therefore, it doesn't really affect anything, because a strategy is where you're going long term. This is a huge bump, I get that. And it may change the way you operationalize certain things. So, you know, one of the reasons e-commerce is so popular in China, it got popularized around SARS, didn't it? You know, these things have massive effects on how things work. Doesn't mean you can't make things work. Maybe you just have to make them differently. So for instance, I work with a lot of healthcare companies, and actually, if you think about it, now is your moment as a healthcare, as an international health focused company. Now is your moment, because there is a lot of anxiety amongst Chinese consumers with regarding the safety of domestic products. So why would you say delay your strategy? Now is the moment to really review what you're doing and seek out the opportunity. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same for anybody who is looking to go into the online business. Anything where digital apps, e-commerce, people are not going outside on the streets. They're ordering food from companies that are similar to Deliveroo to order their food, or online grocery shops. To actually gaming apps, because people are bored at home.
That's really interesting.
Online video streamings and things like that, because people have nowhere to go but stay at home. People are exercising at home, so they're also looking at workout videos and all of these types of things.
So the high level objective
So,
does not change. The delivery means does,
no,
as you say. So I
yes,
was reading about
yes,
a company that has just started doing their marketing through gaming apps in response to the crisis because they've realized there's a
right,
spike in people using gaming apps.
right.
Suddenly the purchases in fresh food have really escalated. The takeaway market hasn't really been that affected in the coronavirus, but people are a bit worried about disease transmittal. But fresh food purchases gone off the roof. So,
Yeah.
like you say, there are lots of
There
unforeseen
are so many
consequences.
opportunities. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. Ellie, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you so much for coming in
My
and
pleasure.
giving today's presentation. We're going to see you anyhow tomorrow for part 2, which is
Yep.
looking at the sales strategy. On the previous slide, you've got all of Ellie's details. If you want to book in a session with me as well, because I'll be talking on day 3, day 4, I'm going to add the link into the chat section, and you can set up a strategy session with me as well. Please don't forget, we've got Ellie's session tomorrow on how to create a sales strategy for the Chinese market. On Wednesday, we're going to be looking at your China roadmap. And on Thursday, we're going to look at how to execute your China strategy. If you haven't registered for those 3 days, you can do so on woodburnglobal.com/events. And last but not least, Ellie touched on this. We are planning a live workshop in London on May 6th. If you are interested in developing your own strategy with us, then join Ellie and I. We're going to be providing this full-day workshop on build your strategy for China. If you're interested and you want some details about it, email me, Christina@woodburnglobal.com, and we will then send you the details. So again, Ellie, thank you very much for coming. I
Thank you
hope
very much for
that
having me.
we'll see some of the attendees again tomorrow. Thank you and
Brilliant.
goodbye.
Thanks.